All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Churchill Club. My name is Karen Tucker, I'm CEO, and this morning's program is called Transformation of Work and the Workplace. Here to address what they believe matters most in the times ahead, we have a very remarkable group of speakers. Stowe Boyd from GigaOM Research, Betsy Flanagan from WorkStrengths, Sudhakar Ramakrishna from Citrix, Toni Schneider from True Ventures, and of course our moderator, Chui of McKinsey Global Institute. Welcome and thank you very much for being with us this morning. I'd like to thank Citrix, in particular Stacy St. Louis, for generously hosting this program and enabling our gathering this morning. So thank you to Citrix. A few words about the Churchill Club. We've been operating as a nonprofit technology-related business forum since 1985, so we're in our 30th year right now. And our mission is to encourage innovation, economic growth, and societal benefit. We do this through the up to 40 or so programs that we present each year where like minds, such as the people in this room, can connect with one another and connect with new ideas. We respectfully request that our speakers refrain from pitching, but rather to seek to advance collective thinking and understanding, and to, in their own, maybe even push their own thinking to help us all to meet the future with perhaps more gusto and better ideas. We're a nonprofit, as I say, community benefit organization, and we're very collaborative with the community. If you have ideas for programs, we will always be happy to hear from you, and we hope that you will consider joining in, supporting, and participating as a member. Our next program is on February 26th at Wharton, San Francisco, and there we will be looking at the decline of global growth, the trends in the decades ahead, and the idea of using productivity to help mitigate that and even, in fact, surpass some of those declines. And the speakers are going to be Jana Reams from McKinsey Global Institute and Hal Varian, who's chief economist at Google. So I hope you'll join us for that. And now it's time to turn this over to Chui to dive into our discussion. Michael.
Thanks, Karen. Thank you very much. Thanks to the Churchill Club for convening this discussion on a very important topic. Thanks to our august panel. And Citrix for hosting us, and then all of you, those of you here in person as well as those of you on the web for participating in what we think will be very important. You know, as we looked at this topic, there's nothing that could be more important as we think about the future. In the last 30 years, you know, our own research at the McKinsey Global Institute show that over 1 billion people have been added to the global workforce. In the next 15 years, over 500 million will be added to that workforce. But that workforce and that workplace is changing radically as a result of technology, as a result of many things that are happening here in the Silicon Valley. And so we wanted to convene a discussion about how those things are changing, what we might see in the future, what are the tools, what are the practices, and what are the impacts on all of us as people, as workers, and as employers, as employees. So with that, why don't we get the conversation started? Betsy, if I could turn to you first. Sure. You know, we talked earlier about some of the ways in which the global workforce and work is changing. Can you talk about some of those, you know, maybe call them demographic factors or trends that we're seeing, and then maybe we'd take that as a jumping off point for the rest of our discussion?
Sure, thank you. You know, I think about the millennials and the impact that they're having. You know, right now they make up roughly 36% of the workforce. Within 5 years, it'll be 46, and in another 5 years, it'll be over 70%.
When you say millennials, tell us what you mean.
So depending on where you look, you know, born between 1980 and 2000, roughly, bigger than the boomer generation. And I think of them as, you know, they have been called the echo boomers. So I actually think of them as very much the children of the boomers, and that they have all the idealism of the boomers plus the financial backing of the boomers. So they have this luxury of, you know, 50% say they'd rather have no job than a job that they don't want. You know, and you couple that with 70% of Americans are not engaged in their work, And it's astonishing that, just kind of what's happening and the need for businesses to really engage the workforce, and especially millennials going forward, since they're going to be such an enormous part of the workforce. So, that's the biggest trend that I see. I also see this, you look at the education system, and we're not preparing people in the way that we need to be preparing them. I have some stats on that, and we can get into that later, or I can talk about it now.
So we have millennials education. What are the other big things that you're
well,
seeing?
just that you look at. So our education system was created in a time when information was scarce.
Sure.
Right now it's abundant. So all the skills that you needed when information was scarce are very vastly different than what you need when information is abundant. And so the education system has been very slow to change. And you talk to chief academic officers, think 96% say they're doing a great job of preparing millennials for the workforce, or students for the workforce. And then you look at business leaders, and they say only 11% are, do they feel like they're really well prepared. So that is an enormous gap. There's also an incredibly inefficient way in terms of how people choose careers, and people choose the jobs that they're going to take. There's, certainly with big data, we will be solving that going forward, but there's an enormous, underemployment that happens because people don't use their strengths. They don't find the right fit for them. They don't get the right skills that they need.
How many millennials are in the room, actually, before we start talking about you?
Wow, almost none.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Oh, there's a few. Oh, a whole table of them. Excellent.
Table of mutants.
Let's talk a little bit about them.
There's one there.
Right. So Betsy, you've mentioned a few facts about them. I'd open it up to the rest of the panel. Right? Please, though.
Well, we did some research with Adobe last year, a series of reports on the modern workforce at GIGO and research. And it was very focused on tools and communications and the use of devices and so on. And what we found, although we didn't leave out things like face-to-face, for example, what we found about the millennials is they're like everyone else, only more so. They're decidedly non-ambivalent about using every possible communications tool or pattern or practice. A very small number, like only 3% of millennials, show a disinclination to try some new technology that might potentially lead to better communication, coordination, and so on. And as you look at older cadres of workers, they become increasingly ambivalent about it, till you get to the boomers, where it's like 25 or 30%, depending on the country you're in, who say that they don't want to invest time and energy in some new gee-whiz, newfangled technology because they just don't believe it's going to pay back because they've been maybe burned in the past or whatever. So as a result, they're just as inclined to face-to-face communication and as other groups, and are inclined to work remotely, and they'll do everything. And so this was sort of a surprise to us, because we thought, in particular, we thought they would be more oriented to remote work and using devices to communicate, and less interested in face-to-face communication. But it turns out they're not. They're actually more inclined to face-to-face communication than boomers are.
So they want to use everything.
They want everything, with whipped cream on top.
Sudhakar, I'm sure your company is hiring many of these folks. What is it like to manage this generation of workers?
Yeah, I actually tend to agree that they tend to want to experiment with a lot of the tools and want to basically leverage what's out there. But equally, they are very strong in their views on what they want to use as well. I mean, I'm sure we've heard about trends like bring your own device and so on and so forth in the industry. I would say a lot of that is being driven by the millennials and their work habits and their learning habits as it relates to when they were in schools and colleges. I mean, many of them started chatting before they started talking, so to speak. right? So a lot of those types of behaviors are now getting infiltrated, and I use that word in a positive way, into organizations, and that drives innovation, that drives productivity, and that drives different forms of collaboration. So it's been a learning experience both for them as well as the non-millennials, so to speak, in terms of how to work together for productive causes. And therein lies, I would say, opportunity, and therein lies friction. And one way to address that is through tools and techniques and behaviors.
What have you found that works and what doesn't work when you try to mesh these different types of communication, different types of
I'd
work?
say this is going to be an ongoing quest, and there is no magic formula, I don't believe. And I would love to hear about the Adobe experience. And I wonder if that study was conducted by Adobe Connect.
No, no,
or,
it was conducted by Giggle
by
Research.
you, okay. Because I don't think there's one set formula. Because one of the things that we don't seem to fully appreciate is that we genericize by age, as in millennials, but the workforce also is more global now. So millennial behavior, let's say, in India may be very different than in China, for instance. And so we have to normalize for those, or frankly, not attempt to normalize in some cases to unlock their true potential. So we continue to experiment, not just at Citrix, and I don't want to make this a Citrix discussion, as much as, broadly speaking, as people who are focused on delivering solutions to customers in a wide variety of industries. So I think it depends how you look at it.
Toni, other observations to add?
Yeah, so my view on this is very specific and narrow because I've spent the last 9 years building an organization that is completely distributed. So I've been with a company called Automattic, first 8 years as CEO, and last year as a board member, and I'm still at the company. And we set out, actually we didn't really plan on this, but we ended up now, we have a company with over 300 people. It's completely distributed all over the world. 300 people, 39 countries, everybody works from home. And we have learned a lot of things. We've sort of built a lot of things over the years to make this work for us. And I think what's interesting to mention too is we're not like 300 consultants or contractors working sort of on our own thing. We all work together on a piece of software. Our main product is software called WordPress. It's a publishing platform. And it's a very successful product, and it competes with traditionally organized companies like the Googles and the Adobes of the world, and it does really well. And so we've found that for us, we can build a sort of traditional Silicon Valley software product, but in this very non-traditional organization. And I'm not sure if it's millennial specific or not, but I think what's worked really well for us in this form of running a company is probably two basic things. One is that when you are distributed, you have to overcome some challenges. Obviously, there's a lot less face-to-face time, and you have to organize yourself differently, use different tools, but you're opening up huge efficiencies. We have a global talent pool that we can recruit from. We don't care about what's happening here in the Bay Area and how hard it is to find engineers. And so as a company, we love it. And employees love it because you get huge flexibility. And this is probably something that the younger generation expects a lot more of. Flexibility of how to work, where to work, and a communication style that's much more, like you said, people chat first before they talk. Our whole company is chat-based. It's basically one giant group text chat room where everybody constantly communicates all day long, all via text. We barely talk to each other. It's a completely sort of written communication type company. And that suits a lot of people, that kind of environment. So I think that's one thing we've learned that works really well. The second thing that we've learned is that we're very much a mission-driven company, not a profit-driven company. And I think this resonates with a lot of people, especially younger people. And in our case, our software is open source. So we have 300 employees, but we actually have over 20,000 people who contribute to the software from all over the world. So it's a completely open platform where anybody can join in who believes in our mission, which is to democratize publishing in our case, which resonates with a lot of people because it has to do with free speech and with allowing anybody in the world to express themselves on the internet, to share their knowledge for free. And most of the people, I think everybody who works for us basically says that they do it for the mission, and it's incredible that you also get paid for it. But it's really, it's not your, I would consider maybe the more typical Silicon Valley type of approach of, yeah, this is a great product, but I'm really hoping to strike it rich, and if in a couple of years it hasn't happened, I'm going to go try with some other company. We have a very opposite type of dynamic, and I think that appeals a lot to the newer generation.
Yeah. Let's return to that. Let me pull on another thread that came out of the conversation, which is about tools. Your company actually has a tool. People are using different tools. We've talked about texting before talking. Stowe, maybe you could, from your studies and your work, what are your observations about how the tools landscape is changing, the ones that change the way that people work, interact, have conversations in the workplace?
Well, the biggest single impact has been from the rise of mobile devices. And I'm working on a report right now on what I call work media tools, which are the tools that people use internally to coordinate their work the way that Toni was describing. And that's changed. That world has changed very dramatically in the last just few years since I wrote the last version of this report because of the impact of mobile. And mobile has this astonishing impact because we're now used to the idea of having a dozen apps on our phones or our tablets and to readily switch from one to the other. So we have very narrow and deep applications, and we'll tolerate this fragmentation of technology, of tools, because it's relatively simple on a mobile device to reconnect to all your social contacts because it's in the contacts on your device. Mm-hmm. So the cost of having to switch from one to the other has gotten very low. And so the big change we're now seeing is the fragmentation, the fracturing of the former desktop kind of technologies, which were intended to be very broad and sort of narrow, a single technology to rule them all inside of an enterprise. Everyone's, asked to or coerced into using that one technology, and it works reasonably well for everyone, but not really perfectly for anybody. However, the rise of apps on mobile devices is changing that dramatically because people would rather have a very narrowly focused app that does something really well and switch from one app to another. So as a result, as one data point just this week, one competitor, Jive, has just come out with a great term. I loved it. Of course, they hinted to me about it before, so I had an inclination. So they're calling these work style tools. So they're building very narrow and deep applications for mobile first and maybe mobile only, really. And so we're seeing that same trend with other major vendors and also, obviously, the small startups. So I think we'll see an acceleration of that trend. We'll see hundreds of very specialized apps that people use. So the field salespeople in your company might use a very specific app for what they do, whereas your marketing folks would use a completely different app that integrates very well with the digital transformation of the connection to the customer, and so on and so on. We'll see less of the sort of very large and lateral applications. And that is accelerating, and it's very disruptive to the marketplace. And I think ultimately, though, the thing that was said at the beginning, the goal of the Churchill Group was, among other things, to help people think about increased productivity in a time of where it seems to be escaping us. The reality is the promise of social collaboration tools in the last 5 years hasn't materialized. It's been a kind of a ho-hum experience. And now I think, however, this new approach and the rise of mobile and in the hands of increasingly a millennial workforce and a workforce with lots of freelancers in it, roughly 30% now and rapidly increasing, I think in that context we'll see a different take, a different angle being applied to trying to get productivity increase. And if we don't, we're kind of sunk anyway.
Other people have complained, though, that we need to collaborate more across the enterprise. So how will that happen if people are using these increasingly narrow slivers of apps?
I think the way that the fracturing will work in many ways. So most people typically do most of their work with a small group of people on a day-to-day basis. A small team, 12 people, something like that. It's really unmanageable to get beyond that. And as a result, the different kinds of coordination of work that you do with the people that you're working with every day on the thing that is your primary focus is quite different than the kind of coordination and conversation you have with people who you talk to several times a week or twice a month. And I think what will happen is we'll have different tools for those things. And there will be some kind of cross-integration so that you can take information from here and have it in the context of your discussion. This is what I call contextual conversation. And so there'll be a fluidity of information moving from one conversational thread in one tool, and you might have that Zendesk ticket going from one context to another so that different people can talk about it at different times. But they might be moving from one tool to another. And of course, the operating systems that we're using on our mobile devices, until quite recently, that kind of sharing across apps wasn't possible at all. Only now, the apps that we've got, the OSs that we've seen rolled out last year and this year, was it commonplace that apps could start sharing that information. So we've been held back by our platforms, as well as the idealized notion we have of how a company operates. Both of those were holding us back, and now we're free to have new models in our minds of how people can do this work and the kinds of tools we can use to get it done.
That suggests new entrepreneurial opportunities
Huge.
to create those apps, et cetera.
Yeah.
You mentioned conversations. Toni, I know you think a lot about how conversations are evolving, given these tools. Can you share some of those thoughts that you had?
For sure. So I've seen a very similar to what Stowe said, a sort of fluidity of tools that people use. I also see a very consistent theme with teams where everybody seems to end up in a mode where the main tool seems to be some kind of chat. Text-based tool. And even in our company, we started in IRC and we did Skype for a while and HipChat, and now we're on Slack. But it's always the same core idea that in our company, it's probably about 80% of our communication happens in this kind of format. So small text messages all day long. And what I find fascinating about it is, first of all, it works really well. Certainly for a distributed team, but I think for any team, there's a nice communication flow to it, and it works really well in a small team, but then also for an entire organization because everybody can see and jump in and out of these rooms, can see what's going on. It's all written, so it's indexed. You can search it later. So there's all kinds of advantages. And the side effect that I find fascinating is it actually there's a certain type of communication style that it favors and teaches people. And to me, all of this, sort of the larger shift organizationally is, I think when I think of traditional organizations that are much more meeting and sort of voice-based, you have a communication style that essentially says, I'm in a meeting, I've got everybody's attention for a short while, I have the floor, I need to communicate as much as possible. And that doesn't work, especially in a chat room. It's sort of small bursts, people have to be concise, they have to be clear, and you can't, when you watch sort of these communications, it's fascinating because you have these sort of small bursts back and forth, and if actually somebody comes in and kind of dumps in a whole paragraph or two of information, everything comes to a halt. And people either just skip over it or everybody has to stop and kind of deal with it. So it favors people who like that style. And in our case, where the entire company runs this way, we've adjusted our entire process of hiring and identifying and training people to people who are good at this. So we're at a point where, and again, this is overlaid with being distributed, where we hire people all over the world. We can't bring them in for a face-to-face meeting. So we will actually interview people over text chat because that's how we're going to communicate. And we tell people this is, if you want to do well in this company, this is how it works, and this is the style. And we end up we have several people on our staff who, they're They're not American. They're non-native English speakers. Their spoken English is actually not really good enough to be, to communicate in person, but their written English is excellent.
Fantastic.
So they're completely effective and great within a company, and then you meet in person, you realize, wow, and sometimes they're very shy. They don't even want to speak English, but they're perfectly comfortable in text. So it's really, and I really have enjoyed seeing how that works and how I think it leads to a communication style that's very effective and suits a lot of people.
That resonates with me because a number of my employees, especially international employees, are fantastic in written English. In fact, in some cases, or many cases, better than native English speakers. However, their spoken English is not as great, so they tend to communicate much better in written form. Just abstracting the conversation on conversations a bit more. I mean, if you think about a company or an organization or a workforce, it is a set of conversations that are happening,
A network of
at any point in time. And if you think about the most important asset a company has, I would contend it is the organization's memory, collective memory. And yet, with the way things are in the industry at the rapid pace at which companies are evolving, approximately every 6 or 7 years, the entire workforce is being turned around in every company. So what happens is that the organization's memory is not getting preserved. There's no meaningful way of getting the context back through all these historical conversations. And as a result, the same thing gets done over and over again. And yet, we all complain about lack of productivity, and yet we don't choose to take into account the organizational memory that has been built over the years. So I believe this is where tools come into play, and tools that have this mindset, so to speak, tool creators that have this mindset, have a tremendous opportunity to create value, create better employee engagement, and ensure that the same mistakes are not repeated in organizations. So that's really where I see a lot of opportunities in this context.
We've sometimes called corporate inboxes is the black matter of the
Exactly.
enterprise.
There
right?
you
When
go.
people leave,
Exactly.
all that enterprise
It's
data
gone.
is gone.
Well, email is where knowledge goes to die, however.
The most sophisticated tool most of us use. I'm curious, though. Toni, as you mentioned, you actually preference hiring for people who function well in chat. And as you said, it actually has tremendous advantages with regard to, not preferencing people who speak English better, or perhaps, unconscious gender bias, because you might not know depending on what someone's username is. But are there disadvantages? Are there challenges with that? Because again, you might have people who are extremely effective at chat, perhaps less effective at other things. Let me open that up to all of you.
Well, there was recent research done by Thomas Malone, actually led by Anita Woolley at CMU, and Thomas Malone, my old friend at MIT, with some other researchers. And they're the ones that had done some research a couple of years ago that demonstrated that the characteristics of individuals who can make teams perform better were social sensitivity. It's not IQ, for example. If you want to improve a struggling team, you don't put a smart person in there. You put in somebody who's very socially sensitive, and they're able, as a result, to moderate the conversation, make sure everyone's heard, surface things that are maybe things that people don't want to talk about, whatever. They have theory of mind. That is, they can keep track of what they believe other people are thinking in the group. And as a result, they make the organization, the team, work better. But just recently, they did a follow-up, which was really fascinating and very important, showing that the people who have those skills, who have that control of theory of mind in a face-to-face context, which is what they studied originally, it's the same people who have the capability to make remote teams work. And that means it's not being able to see the small muscles around people's eyes work or whatever. It's the theory of mind thing. So you know the people in the group, and you're making sure that you have a balanced discussion, all voices are heard, dissent is openly encouraged, the kinds of characteristic skill sets of people that make small teams work. And so that's fascinating because it suggests so much that if you get the right people, if they have the right mindset of figuring out how to do it through chat or remotely, it turns out they would do just as well if you brought them together face to face. But there is no hard delineation between what makes remote teams work and co-located ones.
I think the point you made about the leader or leaders, I'm a strong believer that for leaders, EQ is more important than IQ in many different ways. And that becomes especially true if you have remote teams. Because it's, at the end of the day, it is about empathizing with the other person and unlocking their true potential. What unlocks one's potential may be very different than what unlocks another person's potential. And you can't just have a singular view of what is productivity, what is innovation, what is the right behavior, and try to enforce it upon them, right? And by definition, if you do that, your success will be very narrow, because I don't think there's any argument that this is a heterogeneous world. So that is where I believe, as it relates to unlocking potential, getting teams to work together, regardless of the tool or medium, EQ is more important for a leader.
I saw that same research and I was fascinated by it. And because for me, it sort of what I believe anecdotally, what I had seen with these distributed teams, and I saw the abstract, I'm like, uh-oh, I wonder what the answer is going to be. And the way they did it is fascinating, because imagine if we said, okay, each one of you around your table, your team now, everybody's going to be given the same problem to solve as a team, and you're going to be judged how smart your team is. Half of you are going to do it in person, face-to-face around the table. The other half, you're going to be sent off into different rooms, and you can only communicate via text chat to solve the same problem. And the question is, which teams do better, face-to-face or the separated ones? And the answer is, it's the same, exactly the same. There is no difference. Now, some teams will do better than others, but it's not because they're separated or not. It's because of what Stowe said. It's because those teams communicate better. They have more social sensibility to actually let everybody participate. So I think, to me, that was a big relief, because there's always that sense of like, I wonder if we're spread apart and we only have these much more primitive text tools, are we losing something? And I think that's where the downside comes in. You ask, what are the challenges of this? And what I've seen is that the teams function really well, but when you're completely separated all the time, there is a human element missing. Yeah. And I don't know if it's because I've experienced the more in-person style and I miss it, or somebody who's never had it maybe doesn't need it, but the way we've counteracted it is that we actually still meet up in person, and we give teams a choice. We say, at least once a year, you should all get together and spend a week together. But you can do more if you want. And it turns out that in our case, it seems to be that maybe sort of every 3 or 6 months, it's really nice to get together in person and spend in-person time. And there is something about really getting to know somebody, to really appreciate somebody, to just have that personal interaction. It's much easier to break the ice with somebody in person. Now, and that might change in the future. We talked earlier about sort of futuristic ideas of better collaboration tools, and maybe virtual reality will solve this for us in the future. But today, I would say, if I had a team that's just completely only using these new communication tools, after a few months, it just gets kind of lonely, and you don't feel connected enough. And connection is what a lot of this is about.
Yeah, and even without the tools, what we have observed in pretty much every company and industry that I have worked at is people want to come together. And if you give them an opportunity to come together even once, when they go back to their remote locations, they tend to be much more collaborative, much more productive, because there is I know the other person feeling. And I believe it's a lost opportunity when you don't allow for those types of forums. Routinely, I find cases where teams have not met one another for 6, 7, 8 years, but it's such a beautiful revelation for them when they come to get to know each other, that they become the possibilities. I mean, at the end of the day, you're trying to find what the new possibilities are, new opportunities are. And those interactions and those conversations spark those imaginations in there. So it's a mix.
Quickly, the experience in our case of having these meetups is very unusual, because I've had lots of offsites with companies, and it's not like that. It almost feels more like a family reunion.
Yeah, exactly.
It's very interesting, and it's not about work. It's not about the work and working together. It's just about spending time, and it's I don't know if it's like having a pen pal for a long time and finally meeting them in person or something. It's really powerful.
Yeah. Betsy, your thoughts?
Yeah, it reminds me of some of the things that Stowe had said about kind of what makes a great team work. The manager has so much to do with that. I mean, research has shown again and again. Gallup has some research. It's 27% roughly is attributable to the manager, and historically,
27 of the performance.
Of the performance of a team, exactly, which is more than any other single component. And historically, people are promoted to manager because they are good at their role, not because they're a good manager. And that is an enormous distinction, and something that going forward, we definitely need to change. There's also research that shows that only 2 out of 10 people naturally are good managers. Other people can be trained to be good managers, but and we've all heard the saying, people join companies and leave managers, right?
That's right.
And so, when you think about that skill of really being able to draw out the best in people, understand what's really going on for them, and manage individually based on that person's, what's going to bring out the best in them, that's something I think that we definitely need to turn our attention to. Going forward in terms of what's going to make successful workplaces and successful teams, without a doubt, that's a huge factor.
And you mentioned it can be taught.
Yeah.
Can it be taught in an organization where?
Absolutely. Yeah. The biggest. I mean, really, a lot of it comes down to understanding what and treating each person differently based on what motivates them, based on what their needs are and their skill level, meeting them where they are. Many people want to, some people really value consistency, for example, and they want to be fair and impartial, and to them, they want to treat everybody the same. The reality is that people get motivated by different factors, and they communicate differently. They have different preferences for communication, and so you're going to get a lot more out of your workforce if you customize your management style to each employee. And that's been shown again. So by far and away, that is the biggest factor in terms of teaching managers to be better managers. And that's really hard, because I think it does take a lot of empathy. It takes the ability to see something from someone else's perspective that not everybody has that naturally. In fact, most people don't, I would venture to say most people don't have that ability naturally.
So do you train people through text in order to manage people through text? How does that work?
I have a book recommendation for what it's like to be a traditional manager in this new type of distributed environment. It was written by a guy named Scott Perkins, called A Year Without Pants. And he was a very successful manager at Microsoft, and he wrote sort of the Bible on project management. And he came to work for us for a year and a half or 2 years and kept notes. And so he came in with his sort of traditional, this is how you run a project at Microsoft kind of approach, and realized immediately that this is different. And he said, like, his style at Microsoft was, well, when something isn't working, you sort of grab people in the hallway, or you get together and you figure it out. We can't do that. So he wrote a whole book about what that was like, how he had to adjust his management style to be effective in this new type of environment, and how he learned it. And it's different, but it's the same fundamental skill set. You just need different methods to be effective.
I think this is all part of to get back on the footing of like looking out in the futures. These are elements of some really interesting trends that are taking place, largely driven by a growing awareness from cognitive science about the cognitive blinders that people have. And in particular, people are terrible at hiring people. Now, don't get mad. I know you've hired people and you probably think you did a great job. But the actual evidence is overwhelmingly to the negative, that people very often will hire people or promote people and they don't work out. And why is that? Well, it turns out that human beings have really deep cognitive biases that make it very difficult for us to not overemphasize common characteristics between us and other people. And that's why you'll go to some companies and everybody's a former athlete, you know, lacrosse playing venture capital firm, or you know what I'm talking about, where there's a very great similarity in the backgrounds of the people there. And sometimes that works because people fit, and sometimes it doesn't work because they have, you know, a group mind meld and they, you know, exclude anything that's
all dudes.
Right, exactly. or all women, whatever. It depends on the group. But there's some really fascinating evidence that suggests that algorithmic HR can do a much better job of this. For example, there's a company called, well, it used to be called Evolve, it's now called Cornerstone, that uses a very deep personality analysis based on looking at literally hundreds of thousands of people that they have interviewed and assessed for their suitability as call center operators. And as a result, very large companies simply hire the people that Cornerstone's algorithm says would stay, and they'll do a good job. And they have very decidedly similar characteristics. They're curious, but not particularly empathetic, which you'd think is sort of a weird, you know, thing. But anyway, the net is it almost doesn't matter what those characteristics are, because the people stay longer, the workload is handled more quickly, costs go down, outages go down. And companies just say, all right, we won't even interview these people. We'll just use their algorithm. And anybody that's a green, we hire. Some of the oranges, maybe, but none of the reds. And it almost sounds like a dystopic science fiction novel, where you're referred to as your color, you know. It's fascinating stuff. But the reality is it may be that simpler approaches that don't bring in a lot of our gut human factor, you know, feel for people could do better than people will. And so as a result, you know, this is another one of those areas, part of a general theme in the future, where algorithmic or AI-based capabilities, when coupled with big data, could lead to the ephemeralization of HR employees. The people in HR might not have a job. Because after all, if these techniques work better, then you'd wipe out the whole HR team except the ones that are responsible for handling things like
I think that might
applications for health benefits or something.
I think that might be true, and I would tend to agree with Stowe on jobs and situations that are fairly static and predictable. But increasingly what's important, and increasingly what's important to win in the marketplace, is the ability to adapt and be agile. And I'm yet to find a tool that can predict whether a person can do both of those things.
I would like to make that bet with you.
Okay, let's do that. So my view is that we have to look for characteristics beyond, call it technical skills. And I use technical skills broadly here. A call center person has technical skills as well in this context. So the focus on adaptability and agility is going to be a premium going forward. And why hiring decisions fail eventually is lack of focus on those, in my opinion. And two is there is still a great hesitation in organizations to set the tone in terms of what are your expectations, what are your expected outcomes, and how are you doing against those. I don't know if you guys share the same viewpoint, but I've increasingly seen that happen in organizations. So when you don't do those three things, then you don't really know if you're succeeding, because what does success mean in that context, and if a particular hire is a success or not. So those are some underlying dynamics.
I think it's also a factor. Eric Bonobo years ago once said that management will continue to use techniques that don't work rather than to adopt techniques that they don't understand.
Exactly.
So cognitive science is something that has come up into like very high level of importance and offers great insight into the human mind today. but just in the last 15 years. But the average CEO isn't reading it. They don't know about it. It just hasn't penetrated the world of business yet at all. I'm hopeful that the millennials will, adopt management that's based on science instead of folklore. But right now, too much of the way the management is done is folkloric.
I like the AI story, and it sounds true, but I couldn't help think when you said that, at what point does the AI say that you shouldn't hire people for this, you should hire the AI?
That's a story in The Guardian
That's
today,
coming.
by the way.
One method that we've used, so you mentioned earlier, we're getting more and more blind to a lot of factors and just focus in on the specific, in our case, sort of the specific communication style and the job that people are going to do. And I think that helps a lot in weeding out some of those biases. The other thing we've done is we do trial projects with everyone for every single role. And I've seen this now become much more common. When we started this 5 or 6 years ago, I almost felt guilty asking people to do it because it kind of feels like I'm putting you on trial, like you're not going to get the job unless you make it through this. But we found a method where we basically say, for a couple of months, let's work together and see if this really works. You can do it full time, and we'll pay you as a contractor. You can do it part time, nights and weekends if you have a job. And because we just don't know from both sides, like how this is really going to be. And so we do the pre-selection, and we get somebody we think you would be a great fit for this organization, but let's do this trial. And even when with some biases removed and us thinking they're going to be great, less than half the people make it through the trial. So half the people we thought were going to be great, we'll end up not hiring. And sometimes they back out, sometimes we back out. Most of the time it's mutual. And it's a great way to say, whoa, I'm glad we didn't have to learn that 6 or 9 months in after somebody has made the full transition.
Let's come back soon to questions from the audience. But Betsy, would you care to have any reflections on how hiring is going to change going forward as people think about?
Yeah, I mean, I think Stowe is, I think both people are right in terms of algorithmically, absolutely, and certainly it's much easier for roles where you have a lot of consistency and you have a lot of people so that you can get a good model to work from. But I do see going forward big data being used to track everyone and getting a much better match between what is required for the job and, and especially and what is a good fit. Even, you look at students and most people go into careers and they have no idea what they're getting into. They absolutely, they certainly don't understand the landscape of what's possible most of the time. And they may think, okay, I want to be a teacher, or maybe I'm a good negotiator, for example. But they don't look at it on a skill level and realize all the opportunities that exist across multiple. If you're a good negotiator, you could be a lawyer, you could go into corporate development. I mean, there's a million things. Same with teaching, right? And so I think that matching process will really improve, and it definitely, I believe, it's going to come through big data. And then that is going to trickle down into the education system in terms of helping people figure out what are the pathways that that train somebody to be successful in the workplace. I also think even a project manager is a common title, but in one company it might require a lot more EQ than another company that requires a lot more technical skills. And those can be very different jobs, like almost night and day. And so that can be illuminated over time through information that's pulled out of the organization, pulled out from tracking people through their careers and gathering and aggregating all that information. So certainly going forward, I see big changes in terms of how we're figuring out what's working, what's not working, and hiring people.
Terrific. Well, we're about to come to the audience. I know there are microphones out there. Just a quick anecdote on the application of big data to hiring. We have we've seen it's confidential, but an anecdote where, in terms of reducing unconscious bias, using the algorithm actually resulted in 15% more women being interviewed than if, in the case where it was
Same thing
traditional
happened with
screening.
orchestra trials where they decided to put a curtain up so that the gender of the player was not known. It led to a much higher number of women becoming first violinists, for
Curtain and
example.
carpet, so you can't hear you.
That's right.
Yeah. So questions out there? First question from whoever has the microphone.
A couple weeks ago, the American Association of Colleges and Universities indicated they did a study which indicated a great dissatisfaction with college graduates in 3 significant areas: critical thinking, communication, both oral and written, and ethical positioning, knowing what is right and what is wrong ethically in a corporate job. What advice would you give to colleges and universities to solve these problems?
Betsy, I know it's an area that
Sure.
you've been...
They need to listen to the workforce, listen to what the hiring managers and the leaders within businesses need. And right now, that is not really happening. That communication, there's a breakdown. Business tends to be fairly siloed from higher education. And so there needs to be a lot more communication that happens between those two. Certainly, it happens kind of at the grassroots level a little bit, but not systematically. There's also certainly some programs that are being put in place. There's an app, I can't remember what it's called, that companies are using to badge students based on certain skills that they're getting. And that may or may not work, but at least it's kind of heading in the right direction in terms of higher education, colleges and universities partnering with businesses to figure out, okay, what exactly are the skills that you're looking for, and how do we measure them, and how do we track them, and how do we get students to demonstrate competency in these areas, and then give them credit for that. Because you're right, you think of, and those are exactly the skills, right? Like critical thinking, ethics, those are not, they may be taught in schools, but you're not graded on them. You don't get a grade for just your critical thinking. It's buried in all of your other grades. So in order to tease that out specifically, we need to do that deliberately.
Another
question.
set of comments on that is, I would ask universities to actually engage with practitioners. So what typically happens is that many companies have university relationship teams, and just the engagement is counted as, I have had touch and I've provided input. But oftentimes what I see is that the real people who are doing the work, who are in the trenches, so to speak, are not the ones providing input and getting input. So that is a practical way of bridging the gap, so to speak. The second aspect I would focus on is getting universities to be much more engaged with corporations on getting their students into internship positions before they graduate. And the third thing I would do is get those students who have gone to internships come back and talk about their experiences, not by professors, not by practitioners, but by the interns, to the rest of the student community. And that'll, I think, build a self-feeding cycle around these 3 things. And some of the universities that I'm engaged in, they actively promote communication courses. So for instance, they'll get people, maybe even freshman students, to build business cases and present to a large audience. There's a lot of fears that you can get out of your system as you start doing it with friendly people. So those are some of the techniques that I would suggest.
Next question.
Hi. My question really has to do, or observation is, what do you perceive to be the fundamental relationship between a worker and the organization it's working for? Essentially, what is an employee anymore? As companies and organizations are moving more to be more nimble, to be more agile, to have an increasingly contingent component to their workforce. And as workers are looking to have to be skilled at moving very quickly from organization to organization, project to project, how do you think that is sort of transforming the nature of work and the fundamental relationship between organizations and those who do work?
Maybe Stowe?
Well, you know, the rise of the contingent or precarious, depending on how you look at workforce, has been, you know, remarkably fast, and, you know, is probably the most obvious aspect of the changing social contract between people doing work and businesses. You know, so the number of full-time employees has consistently gone down and is probably pretty well linked to the growing inequity we have, inequality of income and distribution of the results of you know, corporate profits at an all-time high and people getting paid more or less what they were in the 90s. Seems like a bad relationship somehow. So there are some really fundamental economic, social, societal issues at work. I'm going to point at just one data point, because I could, you know, we could talk about this for hours, but I'll talk about one data point and point at it as sort of both a pro and a con. The rise of what I call, I won't call them that, the rise of these freelancer platforms, marketplaces, is actually very positive in a way. They have the ability to act as a broker, a fair arbiter between freelancers and companies, and they can do things like set market prices in a very efficient way. And they really have stepped forward to fill a gap that formerly might have been filled by government or unions or other institutions who have not, or maybe step back is the wrong term, but haven't moved actively into the new economics we have in the workforce today. I find it interesting that some of these organizations will be working with literally hundreds of thousands of companies and ultimately are involved in the work lives of millions or tens of millions of people. And they fill an active role in making it a safer and fairer place to work for both sides. Good for the companies and good for the workers. The bad actors are found and pushed out, and prices are set, commitments are met. It's really a very positive thing. And of course, these are people that are doing it with the intention of making money. They're not doing it just to make the world a better place, but in it, you know, at least by a second order effect, they are making the context for all of that better for everyone. I think that's really heartening. And I think increasingly we'll have to look to agencies like that. People who are creating for-profit businesses that are either explicitly or, you know, by byproduct, making, you know, the world a better place for workers.
What's the flip side of that? You also described it as the precarious.
Well, because people are in a precarious situation. There are, you know, many people who are actively in the world as freelancers doing it because they want to. They have the right skill set, they have the right mindset, and it all works. But there's a very large proportion of people who are working as freelancers, the contingent workers, who would rather have a full-time job, a steady job, where they could know, for example, what hours they're going to be working next week and how many and for who. And so there's a decidedly large downside for at least a segment of that population who are, you know, it's less of being a freelancer and more of contingent work.
How big is that segment?
It's probably at least a third, if not fully a half, of the people that are freelancing.
Next question. Who has the mic?
I have the mic. Question really for the two of you, I think. Does a distributed workforce diminish disruptive innovation? And if so, what do you do to create more epiphanies and get them back to you?
My view is, in some cases, you can build an argument both ways. Let me make the case for why it does not. a distributed workforce has, if you go about thinking about empathy and context, it is, I would say, presumptuous to say we can all sit in Silicon Valley and imagine what the needs of the market in Korea are and create disruptive innovations for them. What better way to do it? By being in the region itself. Then there is this notion of reverse innovation, which is taking things that have been done elsewhere out of context and applying them to the current context. So that is a case of distributed workforce facilitating new and bigger and greater innovations. However, there can be a case made for being in the same room, nothing like being in the same room face to face, letting the sparks fly, and really getting your ideas flowing. So I can build a case in both situations. I don't think it's an either or from my perspective.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think it's related to that. And if anything, I know a lot of big companies who the first thing they do when they try and be more innovative is they take a few people and take them out, put them somewhere else and separate them off and sort of, so I feel like there's a sense that innovation and disruption maybe needs to happen more in a small team, but I think that team could be together or virtual. I think there's just a certain dynamic of people and a willingness to take a little bigger risk, to think a little bit longer term, and obviously willingness of the organization to support that with resources, but I think it could happen in either way.
Next question.
So you've talked a lot about different types of communication tools that you use in the workplace. I was wondering if you could name some examples, whether it's apps on phones, applications running on computers, hardware that assists you with making calls. Just wanted to get to know what you guys are using.
Two from each.
Well, it's already been mentioned, Slack, the fastest growing software as a service company in the world, is now valued at over $1 billion, and they went public. Their beta was public in January of 2014. So they're an amazing case study, fascinating. Toni's company is using it. I'm also a real fan of believe it or not, a Microsoft product. So they bought a company a couple of months ago called Accompli, and it's now been rebranded as Outlook for iOS. And since we are living in a world where, lamentably, we have to communicate with people we don't know very well, at the very least, and probably a large number of people we know relatively well by email, it's kind of astonishing to me that my favorite Gmail client is from Microsoft.
Two tools.
Yammer. I see a lot of companies using Yammer very successfully. And Basecamp.
I'll stick closer to home. We have a wonderful solution called Zen Mobile, which is a set of productivity applications for the enterprise that are fully integrated, going back to Stowe's point about picking information from one app, transporting to another, and keeping the context going, and GoToMeeting.
For us, I think it's important to say what we don't use. We do not use email at all in our company. Like Stowe said right now, and it changes a lot, I would say about 70 to 80% of everything is done on Slack. And the rest is we use WordPress internally for sort of document collaboration. People use wikis and other things. And then for in sort of more video and in-person right now, we use Google Hangouts.
Another question?
Yeah, Hangouts would have been my third if I had three. You cheated.
Hey guys, great conversation. Two questions. One is work-life balance in a distributed workforce model. Love your thoughts on that. And then my son is in the class of 2028. I wanted to know what you are thinking from a future-wise. What's he going to be dealing with then? Thanks.
I'll start on work-life. So when we first started with the distributed model, one of the big questions I would get from more sort of traditional business people is, well, how do you make sure people are working? Like, and there's like crazy ideas like putting webcams on your employees to make sure they're actually sitting there and working. And what we have found is the opposite problem, where, I actually think a lot of people have a hard time when you're not leaving the office. There's no kind of structure around that. People work like crazy because they're always at work at home. So we've actually had to encourage people to take more time, get more balance. Ironically, because you think when you're working from home, you do have great balance in a way that, you can go pick up your kid at school and at any time of the day. You don't have to feel guilty about leaving the office. All those things are wonderful, but we've actually had trouble. We've now gone to a model where we don't have a vacation policy anymore. Anybody can take as much time as they want, and we remind people, we sent them reminders about, hey, it's time, like you gotta disconnect every once in a while. And so we have to actively manage that, which was very unexpected, and I think people thought there was the opposite problem would happen.
So we're coming near the end of the time. Why don't we finish with an answer from each of you? What is your advice to the future generation as they enter this transforming workplace and transforming work? So.
I wrote a series on future work skills, and one of them I think is really important is what we call freestyling. Okay, so the smartest people in the future will not be just smart because of their own intrinsic IQ. They will learn how to interact with AI. They will be like freestyle chess. I don't know if anyone knows about this. Freestyle chess is where you can use anything, books, experts, call your friend on the phone, chess programs to play a chess game. And the best freestylers are not the best chess players. They're the people that are best at freestyling. That is, looking at every possible resource, blending them together, in particular, looking at times when the chess programs disagree with each other about the best move. So this is a necessary skill for the future as more and more AI and algorithmic programming finds its way into the world of work.
The jobs that your son may go into may not exist today. So certainly to focus on learning how to learn, because that's a critical skill, learning how to sort through enormous information and distill what's important. So that critical thinking, certainly the ethics, to focus on mostly just those things going forward, and know that things are changing so quickly. They say 1,000 colleges in the US will go out of business in the next 10 years. And the higher education, as we know it, is completely becoming unbundled, right? So he may not go to a 4-year traditional school, and he may benefit from starting to get certificates now in things that he's interested in, and certainly getting work experience. So those are the things that I would really recommend that you kind of push him towards, to get real life experience, get some credentialing, but not necessarily in the traditional way that we've thought of credentialing. And again, the most important thing is to learn how to learn quickly. And there's there's speed reading, there's memorization techniques. I mean, there's a whole host of things in terms of and tools that you can learn for that skill set. But if he can learn quickly, freestyling, he's going to be freestyling away. I'm probably mangling that term, but he'll be very successful.
Sudhakar.
I focus on learning as many languages as possible.
You mean computer languages?
No, actual spoken and written languages. I mean, there is not a lot of focus on that, primarily because I think that helps communications inherently. It builds empathy because different languages bring about, there's a cultural aspect to it. And there's no saying where your son or daughter is going to work in 2028. It may not be in the Silicon Valley. That may not be the place where they may choose to work, nor do you know who their co-workers are going to be. So that's the reason why I would focus on that. And then somewhat related to that is understanding how business gets done internationally, not just in a small sub-region.
Toni?
I'm a huge fan of hands-on learning and trying things. So I recently read an article about an amusement park near Mexico City I believe it was, where kids go in and they do an adult job for the day. Like you get to be a gas station attendant, or you get to work the grocery counter, and it's hugely popular. They're expanding all over the world, and I can totally relate to this. I feel like more kids should be like this in the real world and really seek out opportunities and try things. And Betsy's earlier point of like figure out where you're going to fit. And there's so many opportunities now that businesses are so much more open to doing this because they're trying to figure out how they can be more open and attract more people. So that would be my advice.
Fascinating ideas. Please thank our panel.
Thank you.
I'd like to also thank our speakers for sharing their insights so freely. We really appreciate it. Hope you agree with the people in the room that it was time well spent for you. And as a small gift, we have for you the Churchill Club Speaker T-shirt.
Thank you.
That's cool.
Please wear it in good health. A recording of this program will be available hopefully tomorrow on the Churchill Club YouTube channel, where you can find recordings of most of our programs. And you have been a wonderful audience. Thank you so much. See you soon.
Thank you.
Vic.